Hello. We've had an incredibly sunny May and an incredibly sunny April. We had a very wet February. I think we need to just bear in mind that this is probably a sign from God. Why do I say that? Well, because he's done it before. If you look in Amos chapter 4, you will see that God sends rain on one field and not the next. He manipulates weather patterns so that they're unusual. And there's a great load of locusts, and there's been a major problem with a locust swarm in Africa and the Middle East. What's God doing? He's asking for our attention, but at the same time he's caring for us. We had an incredibly wet winter. I mean, it was very, very, very wet. And that stored up a lot of water for us. And now, while we've had a lockdown, we've had unusually dry and sunny weather. And it has been so good because, you know, when you can go for one walk a day, or you've just got to sit in your garden and open your windows, it's so much better than if you've got sunlight and warmth than if it's cold and miserable and dark. And I personally have appreciated God's weather and the compassion of God that's been demonstrated with it. Now we're in this period of comparative uncertainty as we begin to move away from the lockdown. And we can see that there's been an increasing level of division in scientific and political commentators fanned by the media, which can make us wonder, well, what exactly are we supposed to do? How afraid are we supposed to be? And there's a pull on one side of society for people to break out of the lockdown and just do their own thing and not take it very seriously, perhaps in a way that some Americans are conducting themselves at the moment. And there's been protests against the lockdown in some European countries as well, in a way that happily there hasn't been to any great extent here. At the other end of the spectrum, there are people that are still deeply afraid of the coronavirus and afraid to let their children out, afraid to let themselves out, and afraid to go back to jobs, afraid to go back to school. Now, the Bible tells Christians that God did not give us a spirit of fear, but of power, love, and self-control, or a sound mind. So the first question we need to ask, and this is the week after the day of Pentecost, how much of the Holy Spirit are we really engaging with? The Holy Spirit was given to be our guide. Remember, the guide is not a guidebook. A guidebook we dip into when we want to. A guide is someone we follow. The Holy Spirit's given there to be our encourager or comforter. There's a Greek word which isn't easy to translate called parakletos. And encouraging can be a boot up the backside as well as a nice stroke or a compliment. The Holy Spirit urges us forward to a deeper relationship with Christ, not just in the service of Christ. The two things are bound up together. And so I'd like to just mention a couple of verses that reflect something of God's heart for his people in a book that you might not have read recently, the book of Deuteronomy. Firstly, just after the giving of the Ten Commandments, the fire of God's been on Mount Sinai, the people are scared stiff. God says this, Oh, that their hearts would be inclined to fear me and keep all my commands always, so that it might go well with them and their children forever. When you see areas of society going wrong, you can be sure that it is because, one way or another, we have not followed the Maker's instructions. We live in a questioning age, but there comes a point at which that questioning tips over into rebellion. And we can fall into a particular sin which is strongly condemned in the Old Testament of grumbling and complaining against God, of sitting in judgment over the Almighty. This does us no good whatsoever and doesn't harm God. And then in the next chapter of Deuteronomy, Deuteronomy 6, this is where the first and great commandment comes from. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord, Yahweh, the great I am, is one. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. These commandments that I give you today are to be upon your hearts. You know, one way of keeping Christianity at arm's length is to keep it stuck in our minds, to intellectualize it, to speculate about it, to put it on the edge of things. But if Jesus is in our hearts, he is in a place of lordship, and we must make sure that he is there. We are to love the Lord our God, not just by thinking about Christian ideas. We are to love the Lord our God with all our heart and with all our soul, so that our inward orientation is to follow Jesus first. More than just follow, to love. That love that caused Mary Magdalene to want to cling to Jesus on resurrection morning. That love that caused Peter to jump out of the boat and wade ashore just to be with Jesus, even when he didn't know that Jesus was going to accept him. That love that led the Apostle John to rest his head upon Jesus' chest at the Last Supper. That love that drove so many people in the early church to accept loss of status, loss of income, maybe torture, maybe death, for the sake of Jesus. The deep love that wrote the hymns, that sang the praises of God through the last 2,000 years. But a love nothing like as deep as the love Christ has for us. A love that can be planted in us through our willingness to open our hearts to the Holy Spirit. So today, let's ask God to make sure that Christianity has been genuinely transferred from our minds to our hearts and our souls, so that our inner drive is towards following Jesus, so that our mental orientation is to trust and obey, so that our emotional makeup is being aligned to the way that Jesus feels about things, so that we not only feel a great love for him and his word, but also for his people, and then for his world. So let's make sure that we ask the Holy Spirit to come into our hearts, to touch and change and transform, rather than just allowing ideas about Jesus to wander around our thinking. The Lord bless you this week and grant you grace to move forward in your faith.